Hey everyone, in this section we will look at how taxes affects market outcomes. How does it affect the price and the quantity of the products we are buying? Okay, so in our example we look at a bottle of soda and a tax is imposed on this bottle of soda. The way it affects buyers and sellers is buyers will pay a higher price and sellers will receive a lower price. Now, the difference between what the buyers pay and sellers receive, that's the tax. Now, there can be a tax on buyers or a tax on sellers. Let's take a look at the example of a tax on sellers first. In 2017, Philadelphia introduced a tax on sellers and it was 1.5 cents per ounce of sweetened beverages. Now, the way this works is the price is going to be the initial price. With that, the tax is added to the initial price of the product. But the sellers are not keeping the entire amount for themselves. The sellers will receive what the buyers pay. From that, the tax will be subtracted. Now, here the tax is 30 cents. That's 0.015 per ounce times 20 cents. However, when a tax is imposed on the buyers, the sellers are selling the product without accounting for the tax. And whenever the buyers buy this item, they pay for the posted price. With that, they pay for the tax. So a tax is added on the initial price. Let's look at some of the definitions. We can have a statutory burden, and this is the burden that's assigned by the government to the taxpayer. Then we have an economic burden. So this is the after tax burden that's faced by the buyers and sellers. Then the tax incidence is the division of economic burden between the buyer and the seller. So in our soda tax example, the statutory burden would be a 1.5 cents per ounce and this will fall on the seller. So this is what the seller needs to pay the government. But the economic burden is different from the statutory burden because the sellers are not going to bear the entire burden of the tax by themselves. Okay. All right. Now let's take a look at this demand and supply graph. We have this initial demand curve and the initial supply curve. The price equilibrium price was $10 and the quantity was 1.4 million bottles of soda. Now, what happens when a tax is imposed? It's 30 cents tax on sellers. The supply curve, which is also the marginal cost curve, will shift up by 30 cents. So let's take a look at this graph here. You see what's going on here? The supply curve is shifting up. We have a new equilibrium priced as $30. This is what the buyers are gonna pay. And the sellers are gonna receive $1. So the difference between these two is the tax that goes to the government. Okay. So the buyers are paying an additional 20 cents and the sellers are receiving 10 cents less than the initial price of $10. Okay, now let's take a look at the tax incidence. That means how the tax burden is divided between the buyer and the seller. Out of this whole 30 cents tax, the buyers will bear 20 cents. So basically, their tax burden is zero point 0.2 over zero point 0.3 times 100. That's 66.7%. And for sellers who is bearing 10 cents is 0.10 over 0.30. That's the entire amount of tax times 100. That's going to be 33.3%. So, question arises, is this always the situation? Are the buyers always bearing the higher burden of the taxes? So all this comes to the boils down to the concept of elasticity. So here the demand curve is steeper or more is inelastic. I would say less elastic compared to the supply curve. If the demand curve is inelastic compared to the supply curve, the buyers will bear additional burden of the tax. Alright, now let's take a look at the impact of tax on buyers. If a tax is imposed on buyers, we have this curve, which is the demand curve, is kind of shaped down. So the initial, we had the equilibrium as $1.10, that was the equilibrium price, and the quantity was 1.4 million units or million bottles of soda. Now, what's really going on is we have a marginal benefit curve or the demand curve that's kind of shift down by 30 cents or by the amount of the tax. Okay, so here we have the new equilibrium as this, and the sellers are going to receive $1 and the new quantity is 1.2 million bottles of soda, but buyers are paying $30. So basically we have the same situation like we had when the tax was imposed on sellers in regards to the burden of the tax. So over here again, this buyers, their tax incidence is 66.7% or 20 cents over 30 cents times 100, and for sellers is 33.3%. So just as I mentioned before, everything depends on the price elasticity. Now let's say in this example the demand curve is even more steep or more inelastic. In this case, the buyers will pay higher price or they will bear additional burden of the tax. So here the buyers are paying 25 cents more and the sellers are receiving only 5 cents less. So this will be the new burden of the buyers and this is the new burden for the sellers, which is 16.3%. 7%. This one is 0.25 over 0.3 times 100, and for sellers is 0.05 over 0.30 times 100. Okay. So in conclusion, what we see is the more inelastic party bears the higher tax burden. So here in this example, the demand curve is steeper compared to the supply curve. So the buyers are paying, or their tax incidence is higher compared to the sellers. But over here, as you can see here, the demand curve is relatively elastic, but the supply curve is inelastic or steeper. So the sellers are bearing most of the burden of the taxes compared to the buyers. The buyers are only bearing 15 cents. Okay. So this is how we find out the tax burden on the sellers and on the buyers, and it depends on the curvature, or which curve is steeper and which one is flatter, or the inelasticity or the elasticity of the demand curve and the supply curve. All right, see you all in the next video.